Hey, it's John, and welcome to the interview today. I'm joined by Dr. Daniel Friedland, who is an expert on the science of leadership and author of Leading Well from Within, a neuroscience and mindfulness-based framework for conscious leadership. Dr. Danny helps leaders and organizations leverage neuroscience and mindfulness-based skills and practices to better navigate stress, clarify vision and purpose, and create high-performing teams and thriving cultures to multiply their positive impact in the world. He serves as the CEO of Super Smart Health, where he provides keynote addresses, workshops, and executive coaching to cultivate conscious leadership. Dr. Danny, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, John. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing, John, and the opportunity to be here with you and your listeners.
Yes, very good. So let's just clue people in a little bit on your backstory, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Yeah, well, we're really happy to do that. You know, a lot of the work that I do now is based on my book, Leading Well from Within. And so, you know, the whole focus around that work is if we want to know how to lead well in the world, the fundamental skills and capacity we need is how do we first learn how to lead well inside ourselves? How do we essentially learn how to navigate stress, uncertainty, and self-doubt, particularly in very high demanding, pressure-filled situations, to be able to stay really critically focused on what matters most in our lives and ultimately to the benefit of the lives of others as well. And so, you know, the passion for this work came from, I'm a medical doctor by training, and my funny accent, I come from South Africa, and when I came here in the 1980s, it was a complete culture shock to me. And I somehow held out that when I got into medical school, everything was going to be okay. And I miraculously got accepted into the University of California, San Francisco Medical School by a miracle. And I found myself with this group of overachievers, not only academic overachievers, but also social overachievers. And at the same time, I found myself in the midst of, you know, in the backdrop of culture shock, really looking to find my footing. And what I was really painfully took me by surprise was instead of connecting with my class, I felt painfully isolated because I studied alone. And in my second year of medical training, I fell apart, just completely fell apart with stress, self-doubt, burnout, and I spiraled into a clinical depression. It was one of the most painful things that I'd ever experienced. And yet looking back, it was probably the best thing that ever happened to my life. Because first of all, it fundamentally fried my ego. Up until that point, I'd been very driven by achievement and success. I needed to bury my self-doubt. And now this was naked on the surface. And really, that was the first inkling that I had once I realized that really self-doubt was my core driver and also potentially the core of liberation. Because when I fractured the tremendous amount of anxiety, I had two choices. I could go back and drive myself with achievement, or I could look for another way, which was how to navigate stress and self-doubt. And I knew I couldn't go back to the failed experiment, so I became insatiably curious about what are the best available skills and practices to do so. And then the second insight I had, I'd said to my counselor, I said, I felt like such a loser, like I'm the only person going through this pain. And he says, well, you know, because everybody's so well adjusted and they, you know, these social overachievers. And my counselor said, well, don't you know that more than half your class is in counseling right now? Which was a complete revelation because, you know, and as you're listening to this is that, you know, the further we go, you know, and the burden of expertise is that we tend to suffer in silence. And so let me just say that if any of you are feeling, you know, right now overwhelmed by stress or having, you know, moments of self-doubt, I promise you, you're not alone. You're in great company. And so I was inspired. I looked around. I didn't even know anything about conscious capitalism at the time. And I said, you know, essentially, I said somebody's got to change the environment. You know, I didn't even have the word culture in my vocabulary at the time. You know, that's, well, I guess that person may be me. And so from one phone call, I signed up the entire medical school pretty much. And I created the Ucsf Medical Student Network. They were led by the fourth year students. There were third years, second years, first years in these 25 families we created. And my first experience of leadership development without knowing what the heck I was doing it now in my mid-20s was to really launch the program to the school and then also to the fourth year students who were leading each of these groups as a separate workshop talking about the importance of modeling vulnerability. If that we can show up open and authentic with who we, with the suffering that we're experiencing, we could create a more humane culture fundamentally by first learning how to connect more fully with our own suffering so we can be more empathetic with the suffering of our patients. So I was deeply committed to, and many students came up to me and said that this really was a very, it really kind of touched them deeply in the heart, and it really helped their growth moving forward. And then after I finished my internal medicine residency, I was asked to become the first teaching fellow at UCSF. And more than anything, I love teaching. It's just the joy of my life. I don't have a job. That's just pure passion. And my mentor at the time says, "What is it that you want to teach?" And I said, "Well, I want to continue this work that I'm doing in leadership and resiliency." And my mentor said, no, you're going to have to do something more academic than that. So shut that down. And my second choice that I took up as my fellowship project was to teach the faculty at UCSF something called evidence-based medicine, which is the way that clinicians bring science to the bedside to make medical decisions. And so I ended up teaching the faculty at UC and then published the first textbook in the United States in 1998 on evidence-based medicine, giving great acknowledgement also to the evidence-based medicine working group out of Canada and the UK, who really pioneered a lot of the field. But I became this early thought leader in this field of evidence-based medicine that has now become the standard by which all healthcare decisions are made.
Wow, you did that, huh? That's pretty impressive. Yeah, that is sort of I have a bit of a healthcare background as well. I was a physical therapist for about 8 years. So evidence-based practice has been a buzzword for a long time.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I spent, so I imagine both you and I have been immersed in that aspect of the science of healthcare. And I spent the next decade of my life literally training tens of thousands of healthcare providers in almost every state in the country. Wow. On evidence-based medicine. And about 50, I'd say over a decade ago, I became despondent again. Because for me, evidence-based medicine is about the mind of health. And I was really missing essentially the heart of this work, which was about leadership and resiliency. And so I was determined to find my way back. And the good thing about having the lens of evidence-based medicine was I had a scientific lens with which I could develop this work of leading well from within that is essentially the science of conscious leadership. And so there were two other aspects on the journey that was really, really important for my development as a leader and this work itself. The next part of this was I was exposed to an extraordinary organization called the Academy. At the time, it was the American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. And I was just blown away, really blown away by their work. And I saw their definition. Actually, their definition was profound. And it was, they said, optimal health is the conscious pursuit of the highest level of functioning of the physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual, and environmental aspects of human experience, resulting in a state of being fully alive.
Wow. That's pretty encompassing, isn't it?
Encompassing. It was really holistic the first year. And then I realized that evidence-based medicine wasn't really a paradigm shift that people had been talking about. It was only an evolution of the tools we use to practice medicine. Beforehand, it had been based on understanding the pathophysiology of disease. Now it was on science. But the real paradigm is what you consider health to begin with. Because the first step of evidence-based medicine is asking the right questions to begin with. Right. And if you're in a paradigm of absence of disease as opposed to creation of health, you ask different questions. Yeah. And so I served this organization because I really, over a number of years, I became invested. I was invited to join the board. And then I was invited to become the founding chair of the Academy of Integrative Health and Medicine. That really was a merger of the board with our sister organization, the American Holistic Medical Association. And we formed the Academy, and it's one of the leading organizations in integrative healthcare in the country. And I took that on because I believe the philosophy, but I also took it on because it's one thing to train others on leadership. It's a whole nother thing to be a leader. And I found myself stretched all over the show. Leadership often engages a vision that's beyond us when we take it up.
Sure.
And it asks for the growth for us to grow into that place. So I got stretched. And at the same time, that was when I became exposed to conscious capitalism. I was asked actually to speak at the CEO Summit in 2012. Mm-hmm. For those of you that haven't heard of conscious capitalism, and John, I know that you've been speaking a lot about it.
Yeah, go ahead and define that for the audience again, just in case they've missed some of the other talks.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary organization. So first of all, while you may not have heard of the organization, you will certainly know the companies that have participated or engaged in conscious capitalism. And think about the cultures as I mentioned them. So these are companies like Whole Foods, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, Best Buy, Patagonia, Southwest Airlines.
Yep.
And all of these organizations have come together with a remarkable mission. They recognize that business and organizations are the greatest force for good in society.
That's right.
And their mission statement is, we exist to elevate humanity. We exist to elevate humanity. And they run on 4 principles. And the first principle is higher purpose drives. Second principle is making sure that all stakeholders in an ecosystem are well accounted for. The third principle is conscious leadership. And the fourth principle is conscious culture that drives a thriving enterprise. And Raj Sisodia, who really was one of the early leaders in the movement with John Mackey, who both wrote the book Conscious Capitalism. Raj wrote a book a few years before that called Firms of Endearment, and tracked 28 companies over a 15-year period and found that these companies outperformed the S&P by 14-1.
Right, because there'd be a lot of people that said, oh, yeah, that's great theory, right, to be able to engage your stakeholders or have all of this stuff, but it actually is more profitable is what they're finding as well.
Indeed. And so what I became fascinated by, asking to actually initially in 2012 train these leaders on conscious leadership, which was as much a learning journey for me as it was a teaching experience, because I was learning so much about the organization and so inspired by their work. It enabled me to integrate the work that I've been doing in integrative holistic healthcare, which is this idea about wholeness. So what does it mean to create whole, healthy leaders that create whole, healthy organizations that create profoundly rich client experiences or services that result ultimately in a healthy bottom line for the company? And then through my lens of evidence-based medicine, understanding the power of conscious leadership in designing conscious culture, I became fascinated by what is the science that explains that. And so Leading Well from Within, the book, is essentially a neuroscience and mindfulness-based framework for conscious leadership. And that's really the passion of my work.
Yeah, and I can tell you have a lot of passion for it too. That's awesome. They always say the world belongs to the enthusiastic.
It's just an absolute joy to work in this.
Yes, that's awesome. I'm glad you found that bliss in life and in your work and all of those things. So yeah, maybe let's just dive into the leading, or the kind of the leading from within kind of model that you talk about, leading well from within.
Yes.
What are some? Can you define that maybe with a little more objectivity as to what you mean by that? And then let's talk about a few ways that leaders in life in general, whether you're leading a company or any kind of organization, can do a better job of becoming a better leader using that model.
Yeah. So again, it takes an inside-out approach. So to lead well in the world, first place is how do we lead well from within? But I start out in my programs, in particular, with an invitation. I asked, what is leadership? What is leadership? And that frames some profound insights. And the definition that I find most inspiring and think most accurate is that leadership is an act of influence. Leadership is an act of influence. Now, that's not enough, because you can think of very influential leaders in the world. I mean, at the extreme of Hitler, for example, who was a very influential leader, but took an entire nation and society down the wrong road. So it's leadership attached to a positive valence, to a noble purpose. And that's why conscious capitalism is so powerful, because it's leadership influence in service of purpose, higher purpose. And so when I think about high performance conscious leadership, it's leaders having the capacity to influence the character and behavior of others for good. And when you think about leadership as being an act of influence, a few insights emerge from this. Number one, you begin to appreciate that leadership is not a role. It's a way of being, because you begin to think about what are my touch points of influence in my world. And you begin to appreciate that anybody who touches the culture at work, leads because they have influence. So whether or not you have direct reports or an individual contributor, doesn't matter. You have influence. If you're a parent, you have influence. If you're a coach, you have influence. If you're a trainer, you have influence. If you're an entrepreneur, you have influence. If you write a Facebook post, you have influence. Even if you pick up your laundry, the way you touch somebody, where you can be very transactional, if you actually touch them with an act of humanity, they will treat somebody who's coming next with a greater sense of humanity too.
Right.
So the point is, leadership is an act of influence. The next insight, because we get in the neuroscience of this, is we're wired to connect. We're wired to connect. Meaning you cannot not have influence. Regardless, you already have influence. The only question is, are you having positive or are you having negative influence right now? So with that insight, you begin to realize this is not even becoming a leader. This is awakening to a leader you already are. And so the work of leading well from within is that inner awakening to enabling you to lead from your highest self and serve in congruence with your highest purpose. And that's really the architecture of the work. And the book then gets into deeply the how of that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So to your first point, you're saying that leaders aren't necessarily, it's not a position, it's something that everybody has influence already.
Yes.
So as a leader, is it important for us to be empowering others to be their own leaders, their own version, whatever they are, as far as, like you always think of the CEO of a company as the head leader or whatever, but in reality, it's an organization of leaders that you really want. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And so actually the way I pull this through in the model of coaching, so such a great question, John, is my model of coaching when I work with senior leaders. I work with CEOs, business owners, senior vice presidents, and partly because these are individuals that are highly influential in the organization. And there is a way of coaching that really unleashes the latent potential in any organization. And the philosophy of coaching that I work with is one of self-coaching. So if I can coach, so my philosophy of coaching is to actually, every touch point of coaching, it releases dependency on the coaching, because I'm teaching leaders to self-coach themselves to elevate their leadership capacity. And then teaching leaders to inspire and coach every individual that works in the organization to self-coach themselves to elevate their leadership capacity. So now you don't have top-down leadership, you have leadership from the bottom up, in which everybody feels a sense of empowerment to contribute to value to the organization.
Yeah, it's almost, I was talking with our friend Steve Hall, right, who's a board member of Conscious Capitalism, and he looks at his company as almost as the leader, not just as a profit machine, obviously, but as a personal development tool for his staff as well. As like, if we can create better human beings throughout our organization, there's a few reasons. One, they're going to be happier, they're going to perform better, but two, they're going to go home and they're going to be better people to the world that they live in outside of that organization. And it adds another level of meaning to your work and what you do. Yes,
absolutely. And relationships are relationships. And so the way that you actually show up at work is a mirror of how you show up at home, and vice versa. And so oftentimes it's interesting in my coaching, and I have these six-month blocks of coaching, and many of my clients now, some of my clients have been working with for 4 years. And it's really so interesting that we begin with some of my clients, the work really begins because they're having very challenging relationship at home. They're strained with their spouse, or they haven't spoken to one of their children for 3 years.
Yeah.
And they go through deep work in looking how to reconnect those relationships. And then when they learn all of those skills and practices to reconnect the relationships, the light bulb goes off and says, this is exactly the dynamic that I can apply in the workplace. And vice versa. Sometimes I work with people on really improving culture at work, and then they come back and they say, this has made a huge difference to the way I'm now interacting with my wife and my kids. And so these are universal principles, and the reason for that is it's these principles of leading from your higher self is based in fundamental biology. Yeah. Fundamental biology, which makes this highly predictable.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's a matter of human, infrastructure almost, right? That these things work. It's not a matter of theory or anything. There's like deep ingrained universal laws and biology at play there that make that work. So I think you talk about your 4 and 4 framework. I think that is that the how that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
How much do you want to maybe share a little bit on that, or whatever you're comfortable sharing there for people listening? Because it sounds inspiring to be, this amazing leader and, have this, leading well from within and creating these relationships. But maybe people are wondering, how do I go about doing that?
I would love to do this. So let me give a little bit of a preamble and a sequence into that, so you can understand where and how that framework fits. So the first thing that I do in my workshops with leaders is after really defining leadership, I talk about, what are the qualities of high performance and low performance influence? And there's some remarkable science around this. And some of the science I bring forth is from the Leadership Circle, which they've really got a very well validated instrument, talking about something I've been talking about for years, which is the reactive and the creative mindset of leadership. And showing how the reactive mindset tracks with low performance and the creative mindset tracks with high performance leadership. And they've got this well-validated instrument. They've done 65,360 reviews and of CEOs, and they also have culture surveys. But, the high performance leadership characteristics, high performance leaders with a creative mindset are essentially achievement oriented. They have vision, strategic focus, they're decisive, and they get results. They relate well to others. So, for example, they know how to mentor well, they collaborate well, they inspire others. They have courageous authenticity. Then they have systems awareness. They know how to sustain productivity without burning people out. And then they have great self-awareness. So they are personal learners, they have composure, and they are fundamentally selfless leaders or servant leaders in service of something larger than themselves. As opposed to low performance leaders who essentially take one of 3 orientations. They are first of all, they're threatened by ego and self-doubt. So these leaders can be either they move towards you seeking validation. So these are overly complying, pleasing, passive. These are wishy-washy leaders. They just don't take a stand on anything. Or they're overly protective. They move away from people, becoming cynical, critical, and distant. Or they move against you by becoming autocratic, driven to prove self-worth, and they're highly perfectionistic and micromanaging. So when you look at these forms of leadership, and they highly correlated the reactive and creative mindset with business performance indicators such as sales and revenue growth, market share, really another data set that overlaps with Raj Sassoja's work, why these companies outperform others. When you look at these high performance, low performance leadership qualities, I oftentimes ask attendees in my workshop, I say, whoever here can relate to both sets of leadership quality even on the same day? And everybody puts up their hand. And I said, there's a reason for that. Why do we all relate to both sets of qualities? And the answer is because these sets of qualities relate to networks and regions of our brain that we all have. We can all connect with them because this is biology. And then what I do is I share a primer on knowing how your brain works or how you can better work your brain. And the shortcut to this is I take the 3-part evolutionary model of the brain and show how it maps essentially to Maslow's hierarchy of need, simplified to levels of safety, belonging, and significance. And essentially when individuals feel threatened by stress or self-doubt, they will plummet into safety, into a reactive frame of engagement, demonstrating all of their fight and flight responses. So if they're threatened by self-doubt, they'll fight for control and they'll take flight from anything that leaves them feeling out of control. If they're threatened by self-doubt, they'll fight to prove their self-worth and they'll take flight from anything that triggers self-doubt. So in that frame, that safety frame, it's about superiority, inferiority, victimization, blame, resistance, all the things we see. As opposed to leaders who know how to elevate into a belonging frame where they can hold themselves with greater composure. They can extend kindness to themselves and others. And then they can pivot to the significance frame, which is a full creative frame, where instead of focusing on problems in the safety frame, here your outcomes, purpose-focused, thinking about what are the outcomes that matter most. You're a full creator, you're fully proactive, you're fully engaged, asking, how can I best contribute? And so essentially when you're talking about, when you look at the biology of this and you actually overlap it with the conscious capitalism, which exists to elevate humanity, and you think, well, how do we elevate humanity? It's a Maslowian expression. So how do we, as a society, inspire people to move to meet their needs for safety and elevate to greater capacity for belonging, and then engage with creativity and innovation to bring value of significance to the world and elevate all the way up? And the reason why you're making more money is if you look at the amount of money that's made in each of these frames, if you're in the safety frame looking to stab somebody else in the back because they slighted you, there's not a lot of productive work going on.
Right.
But if you're fully in the groove of doing creative work where you're thriving and you're passionate and you're touching your customers and bringing value, people will come back to you over and over and over again. So it's biology. And so essentially what I do in the 4 in 4 framework is I teach the process of how do you shift from a reactive mindset deep in the safety frame to a creative mindset. And there are 4 steps, and all these 4 steps sit on the foundation of mindfulness-based practice, which is mindful awareness, which is self-reflection, your ability to step back and actually, so the simplicity of the program is I teach individuals how to first and foremost, both individually and collectively in teams, recognize the frame of engagement that they and others are in, and then how to shift the frame of engagement within themselves and others to elevate their frames of being. And that transforms culture. And so there are a number, I can go through the 4 steps that enable you to do that, but let me pause there because I know I've just shared quite a bit.
It's quite a bit there.
If you want me to just unpack any of that or just stream into those 4 steps.
Yeah, let's pause and take a breath for a second because there's a lot of nuggets that you just shared there. Would you say it sounds like there's certain types like this reactive versus proactive kind of mindset,
yes.
Intentional mindset, big picture mindset.
Yes.
I imagine those things are within all of us at times. I mean, I know there's times where I'm incredibly courageous and an amazing person. There's other times where I feel like a reactive idiot, sometimes.
Yeah.
Are there any strategies or any thoughts around making that shift if you catch yourself?
Yes.
You mentioned mindfulness.
Yes.
Any strategies there to bring us more towards the better version of ourselves?
Yes. Okay. So let's get into the 4 steps. And mindfulness.
Sure.
The reason why mindfulness is foundational is because the foundational piece of this is mindfulness gives you the ability to essentially step back and take a view from the observing self, where you can notice your thoughts, sensations, emotions. And I actually define mindfulness as the practice of paying attention with a sense of openness, kindness, and curiosity for what's ever arising in the moment. So you can observe, and actually, interestingly enough, openness gives you a deeper sense of safety itself. Kindness elevates you to belonging, and curiosity elevates you further to significance. And just the mindfulness alone will elevate your frame of being. And then within that, these 4 steps. Step 1 is knowing how to recognize and manage your reactivity. And the key over here is not to actually automatically assume that creativity good, reactivity bad. In fact, reactivity will save your life. And certainly if somebody's abusing your loved ones or engaging in injustice, having a knee-jerk reactive response to stand and keep you and your loved ones safe is an important reaction.
It has its place.
Yeah, so you want to be able, in step 1 of the 4 in 4 framework, the reason it's called the 4 in 4 framework, it's got 4 steps, and then there are 4 components to each step. So, in recognizing your reactivity, some of the spade work of recognizing is to recognize your reactive sensations, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, so you can pick up your reactive signature earlier. That gives you the ability to actually discern whether or not you want to do something about it. And the core question over here, before you decide whether or not you're going to do something or not about it, is to reflect, in this moment, is my reactivity doing me and others more harm than good? And if not, no worries. On the other hand, if you find yourself overreacting out of proportion and going ballistic on somebody, then there engages you in 4 key steps to taking the edge off your reactivity literally within seconds. And these are scientifically proven, so it's literally like popping a balloon. After you do these 4 things, boom, the pressure comes out and you regain a sense of perspective and you can move on.
So the purpose of the 4x4 and 4 framework is to diffuse that state of being. Is that correct?
To diffuse a stage of being with a caveat if that stage of being is unhelpful.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense.
So again, appreciating is reactivity. This idea that reactivity exists for a reason because it's designed to save our lives. So discerning when is it appropriate to shift from a reactive state to a proactive or a creative state.
Okay.
Now, oftentimes we can take the edge off our reactivity when it's being harmful, but sometimes there's things that have got their hooks in us. Sometimes things that have got their hooks in us. And it's really what we then get into in step 2. So the first step is recognizing and taking the edge off your reactivity. But if something's got their hooks in you, it's asking for deeper work. And the deeper work is digging down below the stress and self-doubt, the reactive responses, digging down below that, looking at the underlying stress and self-doubt and the triggers of stress and self-doubt that are driving those reactive responses to begin with. And so in this second step, it's all about reappraising stress and self-doubt. And this gets into the world of cognitive behavioral therapy, where I show you the core skills and practices for reframing your experience with stress, for reframing your experiences with self-doubt, and for taking the teeth out of the triggers of stress and self-doubt that are driving the response to begin with. And those steps give you a fundamental sense of incredible sense of internal confidence. When you can know you can root out, the stress and self-doubt from the base and transform your relationship with that, there's nothing you can't do. And it liberates so much energy that then enables you to pivot to the third step. So in the first 2 steps, which is fundamentally all about navigating stress, step 3 is now focusing on what really matters in your life. And step 3 is all about cultivating creativity by focusing on what really matters. And this gets into the world of positive psychology and the recipe for the flourishing life. And you begin to look at what is it that jazzes your life up, which is the meaning essentially in learning, connecting, expressing your full potential, being of service, and then creating the freedom and opportunity to live all that, out of which comes an experience of significance and leaving a legacy. And the 4 components over there is I have a 4-step process that helps you optimize your health, your relationships, and your meaning, productivity, and significance at work.
Wow.
So the model in those first 3 steps is all about navigating stress, focusing on what really matters, and then step 4 is the most important step of all. Step 4 is the most important step of all because fundamentally what drives our behavior, you can know all of that, but what fundamentally drives behavior at the most intimate level, it's almost invisible that we don't know what drives our core behavior. But what drives our core behavior is the chitty-chatty voice, the internal dialogue that chirps away at us all day long. And particularly when we're under stress, the nature of this dialogue is what if and all the catastrophes that could happen, if only, and the regrets of our past, and what's wrong with me and what's wrong with other people. And that plummets you, that internal dialogue plummets you into the safety zone. And so part of what step 4 teaches is a process of catalyzing growth by transforming your internal dialogue, interestingly enough, leveraging the framework of evidence-based medicine, which is the framework of asking the right questions, finding the right answers, evaluating those answers, and then taking action in the stream of that inspiration and asking, is what I'm doing working, to drive that core insight.
Yeah.
And that transformation of one's internal dialogue then becomes the fabric of external conversations, which becomes the fabric of culture in which everybody elevates themselves together.
Yeah, there's a lot there for sure. You have a deep mind on this stuff for sure. So for us lay folk, because I can totally relate to, and everybody can listening to this. So this voice in your head, something happens, and it's there to protect you, right? Not to make you happy, right? You're the subconscious mind.
John. You're spot on. Right on.
So are there, things like if I get into that kind of mindset, which I do at times, and
Yes.
I imagine a lot of people do, where you're kind of
Welcome to the club.
blah blah blah, yeah, poor me, what the heck, and you're thinking about all this crap that's not helping you. I usually go for a walk, or I'll usually try to change my state physiologically with movement sometimes to help break that chain of thinking. Yes. Do you have any other tips for just for the lay person, and just how do you are there tips to pattern interrupt those kind of thinking?
Absolutely. Well, I love the way you're talking about pattern interrupt. So you're going out for a walk. In other words, when you're in that state, typically the demands in our life are outstripping our resources in that moment. So we go deep into safety. And ultimately the brain is churning on that. And interesting enough, it tends to happen more frequently when we feel depleted, when we're not resourceful. So if we've had a long day at work or somebody's been riding us all day long, we're making a lot of decisions, we fatigue these higher circuits and we become much more prone to going into the state.
Right.
So the act of taking a walk is like literally looking to become more internally resourceful, to become inspired by nature.
Yeah.
So, and you can shift, ask, find, evaluate, apply. What you're describing is finding a better state so the better questions can find you. So, or you can start out by asking better questions. What I find as a fascinating way of breaking the frame is engaging with insatiable curiosity. Insatiable curiosity. And the reason why insatiable curiosity breaks the frame is that when you're in the limbic system, you're focusing on problems. When you get insatiably curious, you're activating your prefrontal cortex, which really is in this high performance leadership, realm of your brain. You literally are elevating the energy in your brain. So in fact, next time I'm going to invite you, next time any of you who are listening are feeling freaked out, or if you're feeling freaked out at any time, John, see what happens if you become insatiably curious about your freak out. Like stepping back and saying, wow, isn't that fascinating? I'm completely freaking out here. I wonder what I'm freaking out about. I wonder what really matters. I wonder what steps I could take to move more closely in the arena of what really matters. The more curious you get, the more you break that internal frame and you shift the energy upwards. And in fact, when you look at step 3, which is, focus on cultivating creativity, looking at the domains of learning, connecting, expressing, and being of service, that becomes the architecture of the great question. So if instead of saying what's wrong with me and what's wrong with others, if you or your team begins to ask, saying, oh, this is a tough moment. This is a fascinating challenge, bringing curiosity. Fascinating challenge. I wonder what it is we're here to learn.
Yeah.
I wonder how we can better connect with all our stakeholders in this very difficult moment. I wonder how I can better connect with myself. What do I need emotionally, physically, spiritually right now? I wonder how we can best express ourselves. I wonder what my best service is. Now you're priming your brain with better questions that elevate your state of being and break that poor me, self-doubt, reactive self-doubt frame of being. And then the other skills, after you frame the question, the find piece is, how do you create stillness within you? You mentioned taking a walk. There are some breathing techniques where you can activate your parasympathetic nervous system to tap the brake on your sympathetic so that you can still the limbic system, opening up your higher cortical circuit so the answers can find you. The calibration around evaluating your answers is, how do I trust my knowing? So looking, for example, do things feel right, or am I just looking for things to feel good? Because oftentimes we just want relief from the pain. But if we only operate on actually pain and pleasure, it's limbic in that kind of middle part of the brain, survival part of the brain. And we won't quit alcohol if it's been a problem. We won't have a crucial conversation that's uncomfortable. But if you trust that it feels right, you'll take action even when it doesn't feel comfortable. And then, of course, the apply piece is the courage to take action on your insight. And then it loops back around, asking the next question, which is what I'm doing working? You drive that over and over again like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. Some good tips there. Yeah, I hadn't heard of the curiosity one yet. I'll have to try that one. And my hope is that I'll be aware enough to actually remember to do that. The
moment you catch yourself, and that's why having a mindfulness practice that really kind of builds the muscle for this is so powerful, because the mindfulness gives you, when you practice mindfulness, you become much more attuned to your observing self. So what happens is when you get into stress, you begin to notice, oh, I'm getting stressed over here right now. And you can step into that mindful space of observation and then literally just bring some curiosity to it, where you're no longer entangled in it, but you have perspective above it. And then you begin to see these opportunities where you can rise to the challenge, and that becomes exhilarating.
Yeah. How is conscious capital, you mentioned conscious capitalism before, but how has that affected you as a leader for your company, like yourself? I know you mentioned the four pillars of the organization, but maybe just in a few statements or so, how has it changed you?
Well, it's been immense, and part of it is that as I was assembling the programs over many, many years, it was really through conscious capitalism that really it catalyzed all of my insight in this. First of all, I knew I wasn't alone, that somehow I wasn't crazy or fringe, that there was a tribe, a large tribe of highly committed and successful business entrepreneurs and organizations and companies that were engaged in this endeavor. And so it's in the space that I've both contributed, but as I mentioned, not only have I contributed, but I have learned an immense amount. There are many programs that are offered within the conscious capitalism ecosphere that are enlightening. And so there's this powerful thing, which is this continuous place where I can contribute. And I'll be speaking at the conference coming up in Arizona in April. And in going to the conference, not only do I have the benefit of sharing, but I have the benefit of learning all of these insights that really kind of enrich this work. And I've got this adage, I learn so I can give. I learn so I can give. And it's just I'm profoundly grateful to be a part of this extraordinary movement. And if you haven't heard about it, I would really encourage all of your listeners to explore if there's a local chapter. And go to the consciouscapitalism.org website to learn more about the conferences that are offered and come for yourself to experience this, extraordinary tribe of people.
Very good. Besides your own book, what are a couple of good resources people listening could look at to become, handle their stress or become more mindful or become a better version of themselves?
Yeah, well, there are a few. And I'm also just reflecting on what I'm reading right now. But a lot of this is highly customized to where I am on the journey. So I'm reading a lot of different articles and resources around, for example, complexity theory. And what that means is I begin to understand that organizations are not machines where you think you can optimize the individual parts and everything will work. It's much more like a very complex living, breathing organism. And when you begin to work and understand this metaphor, you have much more leverage for creating productive organizational change. And in particular, because I work with very complex healthcare systems where there are significant issues with burnout, healthcare provider burnout in the organization, it really takes that kind of approach to finding meaningful answers. And I find my 4-in-4 framework approach incredibly well suited to working in that paradigm. So that's where my current thread of interest is. That said, there's some fundamental work that I believe is very, is super important for elevating ourselves. When we're deep in the safety zone, experiencing tremendous amount of self-doubt and stress and burnout, the heart of this work of elevation, literally the heart of the work of elevation is self-compassion. More than self-esteem, self-compassion is a paradigm that will elevate your capacity to bring great meaning to the world. And the work that inspires me around that is the work of Kristen Neff.
Okay.
And she has a wonderful website called selfcompassion with a hyphen .org, and has got a wonderful collation of the resources that are available around that, and including some guided meditations around self-compassion that I find really inspiring.
So you think that that's the key then, is an underutilized piece is self-compassion. We all beat ourselves up too much.
Well, think about that, John. So look, when we go out and when you talk about vulnerability, that there's some value in being vulnerable to inspire your teams. Well, vulnerability maps to courage, and courage maps to self-compassion. Because ultimately what happens is when we find the courage to take a step, the thing that scares us the most is that we might fail. We might fail. But what scares us the most is not the rejection and criticism of others, but that we might start beating up on ourselves, and we may go into the self-criticism and we might reject and abandon ourselves. That is the deepest fear. So if you could actually mitigate against that by trusting your capacity for self-compassion, there's nothing that you can't do in your courage to take steps moving forward. So that's why I think that that's one of the core practices to elevate.
Interesting. Yeah, very good. What are you most proud of in your life so far?
Hands down, the way my wife and I are raising our boys. I've got two boys, Zach and Dylan. In fact, I wrote a book with Zach.
You did, huh?
Yeah, so this is Leading Well from Within.
Yep.
And this is the book that I wrote with Zach called The Big Decision. And he wrote, it's a story and framework to inspire and empower better life decisions. We wrote that together when he was 13. And
Amazing.
the first part of the book, is really gorgeous. He wrote a story. He's a freakishly good athlete, and he writes the story about being an underdog running back on a underdog football team, and then miraculously moving to the championship final. And on the other arc of the story is his favorite aunt, who's like a second mother to him, is getting married. And the wedding and the championship game collides on the same day. And he freaks out. What's he going to do? What's his big decision? And he goes to his dad. He says, Dad, this is a painful decision for me. What do I do? And his dad says, son, you're at the age now of 13 where you're becoming a man, and I'll no longer make these big decisions for you, but I'll give you a framework by which you can make this big decision yourself. And interesting, the way these two books relate to each other. Step 4 that I mentioned in the 4 in 4 framework, which was the framework of evidence-based medicine, ask, find, evaluate, and apply, is the framework that his dad in the Big Decision book gives to him, that Zach's character has to solve. But actually, Zach had to solve that himself in the way he wrote, his answer in the book that was purely unto him. And then I write the last 11 chapters, which shares this framework so that parents can have discussions with their teenage children. But because Zach has been just engaged in this work with Dylan from a very, very young age, I'm just absolutely in awe and appreciation of just the extraordinary young men they have grown to be. And that, for me, is my greatest source of joy in my life. I feel like I'm the luckiest father in the world.
That sounds amazing. Do you think about your own legacy much?
Well, yes and no. Let me talk it this way: is my purpose. I've got this other vow. I say, I vow to live my life from home. When I get lost, find my way back and inspire others to live from home too. And for me, this quest of actually finding this ask, find, evaluate, and apply process is my spiritual practice. I feel like I'm in service, and I'm very cautious not to impose on anybody else's spirituality. I define actually spirituality as the willingness and capacity to be inspired. And when you ask the question, there's this mystery where the answers come from. And if somebody says to me, look, I'm agnostic, these answers come to me from my deepest values, great. Some people say to me, this comes from the God within. This comes from kind of a deep spiritual realm where I feel connected with something larger than myself. And for me, that's where I believe my answers come. So when you talk about legacy, my legacy is I really am deeply committed, when I talk about inspiring others to live from home, is inspiring people to live from their higher self, where they're tapped into their deepest source of inspiration, that they can pass that on from generation to generation to be in the flow of this greatest wisdom that flows through us through eternal time. And so the yes and no of that is, it's not about me leaving a legacy, but it's inviting people into their own legacy and into that flow, that inspirational flow that I believe is available to us all now and forever.
Yeah, I asked that question of a lot of people lately, and I get interesting answers around legacy. Some people look at it as a tool that others bestow upon them. A lot of people like to use the word impact.
Yes.
Using what kind of impact with the remaining time that I have here on this planet do I want to create? That seems to be a popular choice of words. Yeah,
and in fact, hopefully that answer that I've just shared integrates all of that, because I truly believe, in this precious time that I have remaining, I want to share that message with as many people that are open and receptive and will benefit from it. And I believe in terms of, if that message is integrated and they pass that message on to others, they will inspire themselves and others to lead from their higher selves, where they will have extraordinary impact in the world. And that gives me, in my coaching, when people share with me that, and I'm very quickly to share, they share that they felt that they have unlocked a greater and deeper well of potential within themselves to have greater impact in the world. I make sure that this is not about me, that they have actually arrived within themselves to be able to do that for themselves. And that to see people unlocking that through these skills and practices, to unlock that potential for themselves, is so joyful and inspiring, particularly when they're able to pass it on to their kids and their company and everybody, and then, in their ability, then I really feel blessed to be doing this work. And as I said, this is not work. I don't believe I have a job. I live a calling, and I'm able to work all around the world.
Amazing.
With just remarkable clients that are just who just continue to inspire me, and in the way that they're unfolding.
Very good. Well, it shows for sure. So,
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming by, Daniel, and sharing some insights from your book and how we could all be better, more conscious leaders and handle stress and all. We talked about a variety of good topics here today.
Yeah.
Any parting words for everybody, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I'm so grateful to have the time with you. And I know oftentimes on these interviews, there's a question, that there may be in terms of if I want to deepen myself further into all of this. And so if you have any interest in this work, certainly on Super Smart Health, you can learn more about this work. And there are a number of free videos over there. There's also a link on the front page to download a free excerpt from the beginning of Leading Well from Within that will give you a deeper and richer context of this work as well. And then you're welcome to link to me on LinkedIn. Yep. I think it's Daniel Friedland, MD, and I'd be really happy. And I also have a forum called the High Performance Conscious Leadership Forum on LinkedIn, if you want to engage further in exploration around this work too.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what's the website again? And we'll link to it from this page, but just for people listening on audio only. Yeah,
supersmarthealth.com.
Supersmarthealth.com. And in your book is
Leading Well from Within. And you can find that Leading Well from Within is available on Amazon. And for those of you that are very, very busy, I also wrote the book summary, which you could read in a couple of hours. And that's available on Amazon too.
Very good. So we'll link to all those sources on this page as well for the video. And just for those listening, it's good to have them here as well, where they can go visit and learn more about your good work. So thank you so much for spending the time with us today and sharing your insights. And for everybody listening, hope you enjoyed that discussion with Dr. Daniel Friedland. Yeah. And hope you'll go check out his good work. So thank you so much, Daniel.
Yeah, and thank you, John. And John, thank you so much for this important work that you do. And it's been an absolute joy to speak with you and for all of you listening as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.